The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and Nathan Donovan read it twice before he even set down his coffee. He had been sitting at the rough-hewn table in the kitchen of his ranch house outside Laramie, Wyoming, the kind of morning that came in gold and blue and smelled of pine sap drifting through the cracked window, when the boy from town had brought the post and slapped it down on the porch railing without so much as a knock. Nathan had retrieved it with the unhurried movements of a man who did not expect much from the outside world. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were calloused from years of working cattle on the land his father had left him. He was not a melancholy man, but he was a solitary one, and everyone in Laramie knew it. The letter was from a woman named Clara Hartwell, who ran a respectable boarding house in Abilene, Kansas, and who had written to him at the suggestion of a mutual acquaintance, a cattle broker named Silas Pruitt, who traveled between Wyoming and Kansas twice a year, and apparently had made it his personal mission to see Nathan Donovan remarried before he turned 30. Nathan's wife, Margaret, had died of fever 3 years prior, leaving him with a ranch, 1,100 acres, a good herd, 2 good horses, and a silence in the house that had grown so loud he sometimes stood in the center of the kitchen just to hear the floorboards creak under his own weight. He had not asked Silas to do anything on his behalf. But Silas had done it anyway, because that was the kind of man Silas was, and because, as he had told Nathan over whiskey the previous autumn, a man without a partner is a man who lets good land go to ruin one lonely winter at a time. The letter from Clara Hartwell was polite, careful, and thorough. She described a young woman in her boarding house, a woman who had come to Abilene from a small town in Missouri some 2 years prior, and had been working as a seamstress and occasional schoolteacher's aide ever since. Clara wrote that the woman was 25 years of age, that she was in good health, that she was educated well enough to manage a household ledger and read aloud in the evenings, that she was reasonably handsome, and that she attended Sunday services with regularity. And then, in the second paragraph, Clara had written the line that Nathan read twice, then set the letter flat on the table and looked at for a long moment before picking it up and reading it again. She is, I should be honest with you, something of a headstrong woman, and her behavior can at times be described as unpredictable. She does not always follow the course of action most would consider sensible, and she holds opinions with a firmness that some gentlemen find unwelcome. I tell you this not to discourage your interest, but because I believe a man of the frontier deserves honesty before he makes any arrangements. She is not a difficult woman in matters of character or temperament. She is simply not a woman who will be easily managed, and I would be doing you no service if I suggested otherwise. Nathan read that paragraph twice. Then he set the letter down and drank the rest of his coffee, now gone cold, and looked out the window at the long, flat sweep of his land going green in the April thaw, the fence posts running in a line toward the ridge, the cattle moving slow and distant in the morning light, and he thought about what it meant that a woman's primary recommendation was her honesty and her refusal to be managed. He thought about Margaret, who had been gentle and sweet, and who had followed his lead in everything, and who had died anyway, quietly, in a bedroom that smelled of camphor and despair. And he thought about the silence that had taken up residence in this house after she was gone, and he thought about all the evenings he had eaten supper alone, and listened to the wind push against the walls, and felt the particular weight of a life being lived by only one person when the land around it was built for more. He went to the writing desk in the small room off the kitchen where he kept his accounts and his records, and he took out paper and pen and ink, and he wrote back immediately. His letter to Clara Hartwell was short. He thanked her for her honesty, which he said he valued above all other qualities. He said that he owned land in good standing near Laramie, that he ran cattle and had a fair income from it, that he was a widower without children and without debt, that he was not a drinking man beyond reasonable occasions, and that he was willing to correspond with the young woman if she was willing, with the understanding that neither party was obligated to anything at all except honesty. He asked that Clara share his letter and his address with the woman, if she was amenable to it. He signed the letter, sealed it, and wrote it to the post office himself that same afternoon. He did not know what he was expecting. He had not written to a woman for purposes of courtship since he was barely 20, and Margaret's father had approved the correspondence with a great deal of ceremony. He was not a romantic man in the way that novels described romance. He was a man who understood practical things, weather patterns and calf prices, and the way a horse moved when it was favoring a bad leg, and he did not know what to do with the information that a woman across 400 miles of open country had been described to him in a letter as headstrong and unpredictable, and that this description had made him want to know more rather than less. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Beatrice Vaughn herself, and it was nothing like he had expected. She did not begin with pleasantries. She did not describe herself in the careful inventory that Nathan had half anticipated, the way women were sometimes advised to in such circumstances, a list of domestic accomplishments and virtues designed to make themselves appealing to prospective husbands, as if they were items on a mercantile shelf. Beatrice Vaughn began her letter by saying that she understood he had been told she was difficult, and she wanted to clarify, because she found misunderstandings inconvenient. She was not difficult, she wrote. She was particular. There was a difference, and she trusted a man of his evident intelligence could appreciate it. She had left Missouri because she had found life there suffocating, not in the sentimental way that some women describe their circumstances, but in the practical sense that the world available to her there was approximately the size of a parlor, and she had no patience for parlors. She had come to Abilene because it was further west and closer to something that felt like possibility, though she admitted she was still not entirely certain what that possibility was. She had taken to sewing and teaching because they were work she could do, not because they satisfied her. She had opinions about things, many things, and she did not apologize for that, but she also did not go out of her way to be contrary, which she felt was an important distinction. She said she was writing to him because Clara had shown her his letter, and she had found his request for honesty refreshing in a way that she had not expected from a cattle rancher in Wyoming. She said she did not know if she was a woman suited to ranch life, but she was not opposed to finding out. She asked him to describe his land, not in measurements, which she said anyone could provide, but in the way it actually looked and felt, because she had found that how a man described the place he lived told her considerably more about him than a list of his assets. Nathan read the letter twice, which was becoming a habit where Beatrice Vaughn was concerned. Then he sat down and wrote the longest letter he had composed since the year his father died, and he had written 3 pages to his cousin in Oregon, explaining why he was keeping the ranch instead of selling it. He described the way the Laramie Plains looked in early morning when the light came over the mountains to the east and turned everything gold before the day settled into its ordinary blue. He described the smell of sage after rain, which he said was not a romantic smell, but an honest one, sharp and alive. The way the land told you it was still there whether you were paying attention or not. He described the creek that ran along the northern edge of his property, which froze solid in winter and ran fast and clear in spring, and was home to trout that he fished on Sunday mornings with a rod his father had made from a branch he had shaped himself. He described the way the wind came down from the mountains in the fall, and how you could feel it change in quality and direction before the snow came, how the cattle felt it too and moved differently, restless and purposeful at once. He described the house, which was solid and larger than a single man needed, built by his father with the expectation of a family that had half materialized and then stopped. He said the house had 4 rooms and a wide porch that faced west, which meant that on clear evenings the sunsets came straight at you like something that had been arranged specifically for your observation. He did not embellish or poeticize. He simply described, because she had asked him to be truthful, and he found that he could do that the land he lived on was the one thing he had always been able to talk about without fumbling for words. He mailed the letter on a Friday. Her reply came 2 weeks later and was even longer than his, which was a thing he had not anticipated. She told him about Missouri, about the particular quality of helplessness she had felt growing up in a town where every door available to a woman seemed to lead to the same room, about her father who had been a good man but who had understood the world in terms so fixed that she had spent her childhood feeling like a bird, kept in an entirely adequate but thoroughly enclosed cage. She told him that she had a habit of reading everything she could find, newspapers and novels and agricultural reports and legal documents, because she had decided early that if the world would not open its doors to her freely, she would at least understand the architecture of the doors themselves. She told him she could ride a horse, which she said she mentioned not to impress him, but because she thought it relevant if she was going to be living on a cattle operation in Wyoming. She had learned to ride on her uncle's farm and had been told she was either fearless or reckless, depending on who was watching. She told him she had read his description of the land, and that the part about the sage after rain had stayed with her in a way she had not expected, because she had spent 2 years in Abilene, which was not an unpleasant town, but which smelled primarily of cattle being moved through in enormous, indifferent numbers. And the idea of a smell that indicated the land itself was alive and present struck her as something she had been missing without fully knowing it. She did not say yes to anything, and she did not say no. She said she thought they should keep writing, and so they did. For 4 months, from April through July of 1882, Nathan Donovan and Beatrice Vaughn exchanged letters with a frequency and depth that would have surprised everyone who knew either of them. Nathan was not, by reputation or habit, a man who expressed himself at length. The people of Laramie knew him as decent and reliable, and not given to unnecessary speech. His ranch hand, an older Mexican man named Hector Calderon, who had worked the land with Nathan's father and stayed on out of loyalty and genuine fondness for the place, had been heard to say that you could tell what Nathan was thinking by watching his hands, because his face and his mouth were considerably less informative than the way he worked when something was bothering him. But in letters, something in Nathan Donovan opened up in a way that he could not entirely explain and did not attempt to. He wrote to Beatrice about the cattle market and what he thought about the homestead rush that was changing the character of the land, about the ways the railroad had altered everything, and not all of it for the better, about a book he had been reading, a history of the Missouri River settlements, that he thought she might find interesting given what she had told him about her upbringing. He wrote about Hector, who had a wife named Rosa in a small house on the south edge of the property, and who made a goat stew that Nathan said was quite possibly the finest thing he had ever eaten, and whose recipe Rosa refused to share with anyone on the grounds that it was the one domestic mystery she intended to keep for herself. Beatrice wrote back about everything. She wrote about the women who came to Clara's boarding house and the various lives they were living and running from and heading toward. She wrote about a legal case she had read about in the Abilene newspaper involving a woman who had tried to file a land claim in her own name and the extraordinary obstacles placed in her way. And she wrote about it with a controlled fury that Nathan found both admirable and somewhat alarming in its precision. She wrote about a horse she had borrowed from a livery stable in Abilene and ridden out onto the flat prairie west of town one evening, just to feel the space around her, and how the sun had been going down ahead of her as she rode toward it, and she had understood in a physical, bodily way why people kept moving west, because the horizon always looked like a promise, even when you knew it was just the curve of the earth. By the end of June, Nathan had begun to realize something that he regarded at first with skepticism, and then with a kind of quiet, serious attention. He was not simply corresponding with a potential practical arrangement for his household. He was looking forward to these letters, in a way that was entirely disproportionate to any sensible assessment of the situation. He had begun to find himself thinking about things during the ordinary course of his day, the way the light fell on the creek in the evening, the way the mountains looked in a thunderstorm, the particular stubbornness of a heifer that had refused to be moved to the north pasture for 3 days running, and his first thought upon noticing these things was not simply noting them, but wondering what Beatrice would say about them, and then writing them down in his next letter so she could. He had not expected this. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, a practical arrangement with a reasonable woman, a partnership built on mutual need and compatible temperament. He had not expected to find himself sitting on the porch in the long summer evenings rereading letters that he had already read twice, running his thumb along the lines of her handwriting, which was definite and slightly irregular, as if her thoughts moved faster than her pen could keep up with, and feeling something in his chest that he had told himself he was not capable of feeling any more. In July, he wrote her a letter that was different from the others. He did not plan it. He sat down to write about the summer roundup and the condition of the herd, and somehow by the third paragraph, he had said something true and unguarded, that he had noticed the hours between receiving one of her letters, and writing the next one had become the hours he was most aware of how large the ranch felt when you were the only one in it, and that he did not think he had noticed this quite so acutely before they began writing. He said this was probably a strange thing to say, and she was free to disregard it. He said he meant it anyway. Her reply took 11 days, which was 3 days longer than usual, and when it arrived, Nathan recognized immediately that the handwriting was slightly different, less quick, more deliberate, as if she had been more careful than usual about what she set down. She said she had read that paragraph several times. She said she did not think it was strange. She said she was going to tell him something she had not told Clara or anyone else, which was that she had grown increasingly certain, across these months of letters, that the thing she had been moving toward when she left Missouri, the thing she had been trying to locate in Abilene without quite finding it, might be something that a person could find with another person rather than simply in a place. She said she was not a sentimental woman and she was not given to declarations that she could not support, but she had found herself, on more than one occasion, reading his descriptions of the ranch in Wyoming and feeling, with an unreasonable but persistent certainty, that she would like to see it for herself. Not as an arrangement, not as an evaluation. Simply because it sounded like the kind of place that deserved to be seen, and because the person who had described it to her was someone she had come to feel, across 4 months and hundreds of miles of paper and ink, that she genuinely wanted to know. She said that if the offer still stood, she would like to come to Laramie in September, if he could arrange for her travel from the Union Pacific Station. Nathan read this letter once and then immediately began writing back. He did not read it twice. He had been waiting long enough. He arranged everything with the efficiency of a man who has been deciding what to do in a situation for months without the opportunity to act on it. He wrote to the Union Pacific Railroad agent in Cheyenne to confirm the rail connections from Abilene, and he wrote to Clara Hartwell thanking her with a warmth he had not previously managed in correspondence, and he wrote to Beatrice with the details, the date, the arrangements, and at the end, in his careful, direct way, that he was glad she was coming, and that he hoped Wyoming would be what she needed, and that he suspected she would know within the first week whether the land suited her. Because she struck him as a woman who knew her own mind, which was something he had come to regard as considerably more valuable than the alternative. September arrived in Wyoming with a cold clarity that made the mountains look sharp as cut glass against the blue sky, and on the 14th of that month, Nathan drove his wagon to the Laramie train station and waited on the platform with his hat in his hands and a feeling in his chest that he did not have a useful word for. The train arrived 20 minutes late, which gave him additional time to stand on the platform and think, which was not entirely comfortable. Hector had told him that morning, with the frank affection of a man who had known him since he was a boy, that he looked like a man walking towards something he was afraid was going to turn out to be real, and that this was generally a good sign. Nathan had told him that was an unhelpful observation, and Hector had smiled and gone back to his work with the particular satisfaction of a man who knew he was right. Beatrice Vaughn stepped off the train ahead of the porter who was carrying her trunk, because she was apparently not a woman who waited for things to be done for her if she could do them first, and Nathan recognized her immediately not from any particular feature, but from the way she looked at the platform, the town, the mountains beyond it, all at once, taking it in with an attention that was comprehensive and unashamed. She was not what he had imagined, or rather she was exactly what he had imagined but different in the way that real things are always different from imagined ones, more specific and more present. She was medium height, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a traveling hat that had acquired the dusty particularity of a long journey, and she had dark eyes that were already moving across the street and the storefronts and the mountains with the focused interest of someone who had been looking forward to seeing something and was now subjecting it to an honest assessment. She wore a plain, dark traveling dress and carried a small bag herself, and she walked the length of the platform to where he was standing with a stride that was entirely certain of its own direction. She stopped in front of him and looked at him with those direct, dark eyes and said, "You are Nathan Donovan." "I am," he said. "You are taller than I expected," she said. It was not a compliment or a criticism. It was simply an observation, an updating of information against the reality in front of her, and he found he was already smiling. "You are more auburn than I expected," he said, and she looked briefly surprised, and then she laughed, a quick and genuine sound, and put out her hand. He took it and felt her grip, which was firm and warm, and thought that this was already entirely different from what he had spent the last month carefully not expecting. He drove her to the ranch in the wagon through the September afternoon, and he pointed out the things that seemed relevant and also the things that did not. The ridge to the north where the elk came down in autumn, the particular quality of the light on the grass at this time of day, the way the mountains held a rim of white at their peaks that had only recently appeared. She sat beside him on the wagon bench and asked questions, good questions, specific ones, about the operation of the ranch and the condition of the range and the water rights situation, which was complicated, and which he had spent 2 years navigating with the care of a man walking through a minefield. And he answered all of them and found, with increasing appreciation, that she listened to the answers, and then asked the next question that the answers implied. Rather than the next question, she had prepared in advance. They arrived at the ranch as the light was going orange and low, coming from the west exactly as he had described it in his letter, straight onto the porch like something deliberately arranged, and she stood in the wagon for a moment before he could hand her down and looked at the house and the land and the light all at once. "The sunset," she said. "Yes," he said. "You were not exaggerating." "I know better than to exaggerate to a woman who reads legal documents for recreation," he said, and she turned to look at him with something in her expression that he would remember for a long time, not quite laughter and not quite surprise, something that was both of those things at once and also something else, something warmer and more considered. Hector and Rosa came out to meet them, Rosa with the immediate and maternal warmth of a woman who had been anxious about this arrival for 2 months and was visibly relieved that the woman from the train looked like someone with good sense, and Hector with his customary quietness, and a handshake for Beatrice that she returned with equal gravity, and which seemed to please him considerably. Rosa had prepared a room for Beatrice in the east side of the house, a good room with a window that faced the creek, and had left fresh linens and a pitcher of water and a small vase of late wild columbines on the windowsill, which Beatrice noticed immediately and thanked her for with a specificity that made Rosa smile broadly and retreat to her kitchen satisfied. That evening they ate supper on the porch because the night was still mild. Nathan and Beatrice at the small table he had moved outside for the purpose, with the remains of roses brought food between them and the dark settling in over the mountains, and they talked the way people talk when they have been building toward a conversation for months, and are finally able to have it without the mediation of paper and distance. She told him things she had not put in letters. She told him about the last year in Missouri before she left, about the man her family had expected her to marry, a perfectly adequate farmer named Theodore who had been kind and dull in approximately equal measure, and who had been bewildered by her refusal in a way that had told her more about what he expected from a wife than anything he had ever said directly. She told him about arriving in Abilene with $40 and a trunk, and a determination that she was not entirely certain at the time was wisdom or desperation. She told him about the women she had met there, the schoolteacher she had worked with, a remarkable woman named Agnes Fitch who had been educated in Ohio, and who had read more books than anyone Beatrice had ever known, and who had told her, over a year of working together, that the most subversive thing a woman could do in 1882 was to know her own worth and refuse to negotiate it down for anyone's comfort. Nathan listened to all of it, and when she paused, he did not fill the silence with reassurance or advice. He simply waited, which she noticed, and which she found, she told him later, more reassuring than any words he could have offered. He told her about Margaret, carefully and honestly. He said she had been a good woman, and that he had loved her, and that her death had been a specific grief that had taken longer to move through than he had known how to say to anyone, and that he had emerged from it not bitter, which he had feared, but changed in ways that he thought were mostly useful, quieter, more deliberate, more aware that time was not an unlimited resource to be spent on things that did not matter. "You read my letter twice," Beatrice said, and he looked at her because he had never told her that. "Clara told you," he said. "She told me you replied immediately," Beatrice said. "And she said you had that look men get when they have been surprised by something." She looked at the dark mountains. She said the part about headstrong and unpredictable was what did it. "It was," Nathan said. "Why?" He considered the question seriously, the way she asked questions, as if she genuinely wanted the answer rather than the answer she was expecting. "Because a woman who gets described as headstrong in a letter recommending her to a husband is a woman who refused to pretend otherwise for the sake of the letter," he said. "And I had enough of pretending in enough directions for enough years. I thought someone who wouldn't pretend even when it would have been practical to was someone worth knowing." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. The creek was audible in the night, and somewhere to the north a coyote said something brief and distant. "That is," she said, "a very good answer." She stayed 2 weeks. That had been the arrangement, 2 weeks, after which she would determine whether she wished to remain in Laramie or return to Abilene, and he would determine the same, and they would correspond further if the answer on both sides was yes. The 2 weeks were like nothing Nathan had experienced in his adult life. Not because they were remarkable in the external sense. Nothing dramatic occurred, no crises or extraordinary events, but because Beatrice Vaughn had a quality that he had no previous name for and eventually settled on calling thoroughness. She brought her full attention to everything she did and observed, and being in the orbit of that attention was like standing in good clear light after a long time in rooms that had too many walls. She rode with him every morning that first week, on the older of his 2 horses, a steady gray mare named Alina that she approved of immediately, and that seemed to return the sentiment within the first hour. She had not exaggerated about her riding. She was confident and direct in the saddle, not showy, just capable, and she paid attention to the land around her as they moved through it in a way that he recognized from his own relationship to the place, looking for the things that changed, the tracks in the grass, the way the cattle were grouped, the state of the fence lines. She asked Hector questions about the breeding program, and Hector, who was initially politely reserved in the manner of a man waiting to form an opinion, became gradually and visibly more interested, as it became clear she understood what he was telling her and had things to say about it that were worth considering. By the end of the first week, they were having animated conversations about pasture rotation that Nathan occasionally joined and mostly observed, with the particular pleasure of watching two people, who could be difficult to engage, suddenly find someone worth engaging with. She helped Rosa in the kitchen without being asked, not in the deferential way of a guest trying to be useful, but in the practical way of someone who enjoyed work and was bored without it. And Rosa told Nathan privately at the end of the first week that she had no opinion to offer him about what he should do with his personal life, but that she would note that a woman who could cook dried beans into something edible while discussing water rights legislation was a woman of considerable all-around ability. On the 8th day of her visit, something happened that Nathan had not anticipated, and that settled something in him that he had not known was still unsettled. He had gone north to check on a section of fence line that Hector had reported was down, near the ridge where the elk sometimes pushed through, and Beatrice had asked to come, and he had agreed without hesitation, because 2 weeks of her company had already made him unconsciously default to including her in everything. They had ridden up to the ridge in the early morning, the air cold and bright, the mountains enormous and close in that particular September way, and they had found not only the fence line down, but a steer that had gotten caught in the remaining wire and was in distress. Nathan dismounted and went to work immediately, talking to the steer in the low, steady voice he used with frightened animals, working the wire loose with his gloves, and Beatrice dismounted without being asked and went to the steer's head and took hold of it with calm confidence, and spoke to the animal in a firm, even tone that was neither soothing nor commanding, but something more practical than either. A kind of clear instruction that seemed to communicate specifically to the animal that the situation was being managed by people who knew what they were doing. The steer calmed. Nathan worked the wire free. The animal stood, showed no serious injury, and walked away from them with the dignified indifference of a creature that has received assistance and declined to acknowledge it. Nathan looked at Beatrice across the back of the steer as it departed. She looked back at him. "You have done that before," he said. "My uncle's farm," she said. "I told you I could ride. I did not specify that that was my only rural qualification." "No," he said, "you did not." They stood there in the cold, bright morning with the mountains behind them and the freed wire at their feet, and Nathan Donovan understood something with the quiet totality of a man who has been thinking around the edge of a truth for months and has just arrived at its center, that this woman was not an answer to a problem. She was someone he wanted. Not in the vague, generalized sense of wanting companionship, but specifically and particularly, he wanted this person, the one who held frightened animals steady and read legal documents for recreation, and described herself as particular rather than difficult, and had shown up on a train platform and looked at the mountains and said you were not exaggerating. He did not say any of this. He was not yet ready, and also they were both cold and needed to repair the fence line. But on the ride back down to the ranch house, something between them had shifted, not dramatically, but in the way that the land shifts in spring, not all at once, but so that one morning you look up and notice it is different. On the 10th day of her visit, they had an argument. It was about water rights, specifically about a proposed deal with a neighboring rancher named Arthur Coles, a man 20 years Nathan's senior who ran a larger operation to the south, and who had been gradually expanding his claim to a shared tributary in ways that Nathan had been tolerating, because Coles was powerful in the county, and disputes with him were expensive and exhausting. Beatrice had read the most recent correspondence from Coles's lawyer, which Nathan had left on the desk, not to show her, but simply because his desk was where correspondence lived, and she had formed a view about it by dinner. Her view was that Nathan was allowing himself to be managed out of what was legally and practically his by a man who was counting on Nathan's preference for avoiding conflict to do his work for him, and that this was a situation with one reasonable solution. Nathan's view was that she had been on the ranch for 10 days, and he had been managing this situation for 2 years, and that Coles was not a man you confronted without very careful preparation. It was a real argument, the kind that had some heat in it, voices not raised exactly but elevated, and Beatrice did not soften her position because he pushed back on it. She elaborated and specified, and cited the actual language of the water rights statute. She had evidently read at some point between arriving and the present moment, and Nathan found himself being argued with by a woman who had done her research and knew she was right. And he found himself in the uncomfortable position of knowing she was right, and also not being ready to admit it quickly. They arrived at a tense and somewhat exhausted truce over the dishes, and Beatrice washed the plates with a focused energy that he recognized as someone working off the remains of an emotion, and he dried them with the careful deliberateness of a man who is deciding something. "You are right about Coles," he said when the last plate was dried. She looked at him. She did not say, "I told you." She simply said, "I know." "I have been waiting for him to overextend himself," Nathan said. "But he is not going to overextend himself if I keep giving him room." "No," she said, "he is not." "I will write to a lawyer in Laramie this week," Nathan said. "He is someone I trust." Beatrice looked at him for a moment, and then she said something that he had not expected, her voice softer now, the argument gone from it, replaced by something more direct and more honest. "I am sorry for the way I came at you with it," she said. "I know it is not my business, strictly speaking. Not yet. I just read that letter and I felt angry on your behalf, and I forgot that you have been living with it and I have been here 10 days. "It is your business," Nathan said, "as much as you want it to be." She was quiet. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and the dried herbs that Rosa kept hanging from the rafters. "I want it to be my business," she said finally, quietly, in the way of someone who has been thinking about saying something for a long time and has decided to say it now. Nathan set down the dishcloth. He looked at her across the small kitchen. "Then stay," he said. "Not as an arrangement, stay because you want to." "I do want to," she said. "That is what I am telling you." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and he took her hands, her direct, capable, ink-stained hands, and held them in both of his, and she looked up at him with those dark eyes that were not soft exactly but were open in a way they had not been when she stepped off the train, and he said quietly, "I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd letter." She laughed, that quick and genuine sound, and then she said, "The 3rd letter. I was particularly unreasonable in the 3rd letter." "You cited 3 separate newspaper articles in the 3rd letter to support an argument about municipal water infrastructure," Nathan said. "I thought that was wonderful." "You are a very strange man," she said, still laughing. "You are a very particular woman," he said. And she went up on her toes and kissed him, firmly and without any hesitation, which was entirely consistent with everything he had come to know about her. They were engaged before the 2 weeks were up. He did not make a ceremony of the proposal in the sense that he rode into town to purchase a ring and presented it at a candle-lit dinner. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman. But on the evening of the 13th day, he said that he wanted to marry her if she was willing, and she said that she was, and they shook hands on it first, which made him laugh for the first time in a way that started somewhere genuine. And then he held her for a long time on the porch in the cooling evening, with the stars coming out over Wyoming and the creek making its steady noise in the dark. And he thought about the letter he had read twice in the kitchen some 5 months ago and felt something that he thought might be the word for which he had been looking, which was gratitude, large and quiet and entirely his. Beatrice returned to Abilene to settle her affairs, which took 6 weeks because she did not leave things undone. She worked out her remaining arrangement with Clara Hartwell, and said her proper goodbyes, and packed her actual life into 2 trunks rather than 1, and wrote Nathan a letter every week in the meantime, which he received and replied to with all the particular pleasure of a man who knows the letters will eventually stop, because the person will be present instead. which is a different and better thing, but also means no more letters. And he was aware he would miss the letters specifically, while also wanting everything that their ending meant. She arrived back in Laramie in early November of 1882, this time with 2 trunks and a crate of books and a certainty in her posture that she had been heading in the right direction. And Nathan met her on the platform again, this time without his hat in his hands, and she walked toward him with the same direct stride and stopped in front of him and said, "I am home." It was the first time she had used that word for Laramie. He had not asked her to. She had arrived at it herself. They were married in the Laramie church on the 22nd of November, 1882, in the presence of Hector and Rosa Calderon, and a collection of Nathan's neighbors and acquaintances who had been following this development with the interested attention of a community that had long since given up expecting Nathan Donovan to do anything unpredictable, and was thus doubly entertained when he did. The minister was a spare, decent man named Reverend Colby, who kept the ceremony brief and dignified, and Beatrice wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself, because she was a seamstress by trade among other things, and she had pinned her auburn hair up with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and looked at Nathan through the ceremony with the clear, steady look of a woman who has made a decision and intends to honor it without reservation. Nathan looked back at her the entire time. He was told afterward by 2 separate women at the reception that he had done so in a manner that was, to use the word that both of them independently arrived at, radiant. He was not sure he knew how to be radiant, but he did not dispute it. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a hard one in Wyoming, as winters on the high plains invariably were, cold that settled in early and stayed, with a thoroughness that tested the quality of every fence and every structure and every supply calculation made in the autumn. Nathan had prepared for it as he always did, carefully and well in advance, but the particular challenge of that winter was a late November blizzard that came down from the mountains 3 days after the wedding and kept them snowbound for the better part of a week. And this enforced confinement with one another in a house that had, until very recently, held only one person turned out to be not the anxiety that some newlyweds might have experienced, but something closer to a gift. They were extraordinarily good company for each other. It was not something Nathan had known how to predict from letters, the specific texture of daily proximity, but it turned out that 2 people who both preferred honesty to comfort, and both had internal lives substantial enough to keep them occupied, and both had work to do, were in fact quite capable of sharing a small house during a blizzard without running out of things to say or wearing on each other's patience. They played cards in the evenings, and she beat him at cribbage with a consistency that he found both impressive and slightly annoying, and he beat her at chess with a patience that she found maddening, and they read to each other from the books she had brought from Abilene, and they talked endlessly about everything, the ranch and the cattle market and the political news from the east and the situation with various of their neighbors and the question of the water rights dispute with Coles, which was now in the hands of a Laramie lawyer named Prescott who was, Nathan had come to believe, very good at his work. In February of 1883, the lawyer Prescott sent word that he had found a material inconsistency in the historical survey documentation that Coles had been using to support his expanded water claim, an inconsistency that amounted to a falsification, and that he was prepared to file with the county court unless Coles chose to negotiate. Arthur Coles, faced with this information, chose to negotiate. By March, Nathan had a formal agreement in writing that established his water rights to the tributary clearly and permanently, and cost him nothing except the legal fees, which were modest, and which Beatrice had said from the beginning were not a cost but an investment. When the letter from Prescott arrived confirming the settlement, Beatrice read it at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at Nathan with an expression that was not triumphant. She was not a triumphant person about things she had always believed were simply correct, but was instead something that he had come to think of as her satisfied look, the look of a situation resolved in the direction of justice, which she held in high regard. "Thank you," he said. "I only read the letter," she said. "You read the letter," he said, "and then you told me the truth about it, and then you were right." She looked at him with that particular warmth in her eyes that he had discovered when she was fully content, which was different from simply happy and considerably deeper. "I am going to be right about things with some frequency," she said. "I hope that continues to be acceptable." "I am counting on it," he said. By spring of 1883, Beatrice had taken over the household accounts entirely, not because Nathan had asked her to or because it was the expected domestic arrangement, but because she was demonstrably better at systematic record-keeping than he was, and had said so plainly, and offered to take it over, and he had accepted with genuine relief. The ledger she kept was meticulous and interesting. She had added a system of notes in the margins that tracked seasonal patterns in expenditure and income in a way that Nathan found unexpectedly illuminating. And Hector had asked to look at it once, and had come away with 3 new observations about the operation's efficiency that they had subsequently put into practice. Rosa, who had been watching all of this with the satisfied attention of a woman who had wanted Nathan to have someone in his corner for years, told Beatrice one afternoon in the kitchen that she was, in Rosa's professional and personal opinion, the best thing that had ever happened to this ranch. Beatrice said she hoped she was the best thing that had happened to Nathan specifically, and Rosa said yes, and that too, and then they both laughed, and the kitchen was warm with it. In the summer of 1883, Beatrice became pregnant with their first child. She told Nathan on a July morning on the porch, with characteristic directness, no fanfare and no coyness, simply sitting down beside him with her coffee, and saying that she had reason to believe they were expecting a child in January, and that she was well and not frightened, and that she wanted to be clear that she intended to continue being herself throughout the process. Because she had seen women advised to stop all manner of reasonable activity upon becoming pregnant, and she thought this was medically and personally unjustified. Nathan, who had been lifting his coffee cup to his mouth when she said this, set it back down with the deliberateness of a man ensuring he did not drop it, and looked at her, and felt the same large quiet thing he had felt on their wedding day, compounded, something that had to do with the specific impossibility that his life had become this, and the equal impossibility that it had ever been anything else. "Are you all right?" she said, watching him. "I am better than all right," he said. She looked at him with that warm, satisfied look. "Good," she said. "Because I have thoughts about the Northwest pasture that I want to discuss, while you are still sufficiently surprised that you will agree to things you might otherwise debate." He laughed so hard he did spill the coffee. The child arrived in late January of 1884, 2 weeks early by their calculation, during a cold snap that had brought the temperature down to a degree that made travel inadvisable, which meant that Nathan was present for the entire thing in a way that frontier men were not always or typically expected to be. And he was glad of it despite the fact that it was among the most frightening things he had ever experienced. Their neighbor, a formidable and experienced woman named Mrs. Eleanor Taggart, who had served as the local midwife for 20 years, attended with calm authority, and Hector and Rosa were present in the house, Rosa in the room and Hector in the kitchen making coffee at 3-hour intervals without being asked. The child was a boy. He came into the world at 2 in the morning of the 21st of January and announced himself with a voice that was, given his size, remarkably confident, and Nathan held him within the first 10 minutes, a small and extraordinary weight in his large hands, and looked down at this new person and felt something that had no available word and that he did not try to name. They named him James William Donovan. William for Nathan's father, James because Beatrice had always liked the name, and because she said it was strong enough to survive Wyoming. Young James was, from the beginning, a person of determined opinions and considerable energy, which was not surprising given his parentage. And the ranch house, which had been quiet for so long, became a place full of the specific noise of a child discovering that the world was an endlessly interesting place, and that most of it could be reached if you kept trying. In the spring of 1884, when James was 4 months old and Beatrice was fully recovered and characteristically impatient with the pace of that recovery, something happened in town that changed the texture of their life in Laramie in a way that neither of them had quite anticipated. A schoolteacher left. The woman who had been running the small Laramie school, a capable woman named Mrs. Porter, was returning to Ohio to care for her mother, and the school board, which was composed primarily of ranchers and merchants who had daughters as well as sons, and who were not, collectively, opposed to education, but who were collectively uncertain how to find and appoint a replacement quickly, found themselves in a situation of some difficulty. Nathan heard about it at the feed store and came home and mentioned it over supper. Beatrice looked up from her plate. "I could teach it," she said. He looked at her. "I know I have James," she said, "and the accounts and the ranch. I am not suggesting I do not. But Mrs. Taggart has offered more than once to help with James, and I am not a woman who is going to be content only with domestic matters, however much I value them. I'm not criticizing women who are. It is simply not what I am, and I think we both knew that before we married." "I did know that," Nathan said. "I was not objecting. You had an expression." "I had a thinking expression," he said, "which is different." "What were you thinking?" "That you would be excellent at it," he said. "And that the school board is going to have an interesting time with you." She smiled. "They are," she agreed. She applied to the school board, and there was, as Nathan had predicted, an interesting time, because while there was broad agreement that Beatrice Vaughn Donovan was educated and capable and available, there was a degree of discomfort among two members of the board with the idea of a married woman with a child as a schoolteacher, on grounds they struggled to articulate clearly, but that had to do with notions of propriety and precedent that Beatrice addressed in the meeting with a precision and a patience that Nathan, who attended at her request, found extremely impressive. She was appointed to the position by a 4-2 vote, and she began teaching in September of 1884, when James was 8 months old and fully in the capable hands of Rosa Calderon on the 3 days a week that Beatrice rode to town. She was, by all accounts, an outstanding teacher. She was demanding and fair and entirely unwilling to pass over her students' actual understanding in favor of the appearance of progress. And the children of Laramie learned to read and do sums and understand something of the geography and history of the country they lived in at a pace, and to a depth that Mrs. Porter, whatever her merits, had not achieved. She was also, within the first month, the subject of at least 2 complaints from parents who felt she was teaching things that were not appropriately restricted to basic literacy, specifically that she had discussed the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868 with the older students in terms that acknowledged it had not been honored by the federal government, which some parents found unnecessarily complicated for children. Beatrice was called before the board again and gave a response that Nathan heard about secondhand from 3 different people in town, all of whom had slightly different accounts of exactly what she said but were in agreement about 2 things: that it was eloquent, and that the board members who had opposed her appointment looked, at its conclusion, somewhat humbled. She kept the position. She taught in Laramie for 6 years, and in that time the school grew from 20 students to 34, and 2 of her former students went on to secondary education, which had not happened from the Laramie school before. She was also, during those years, an active voice in the conversation about women's suffrage in Wyoming, which had passed a law granting women the right to vote in 1869, making it the first territory in the country to do so. And Beatrice spoke at meetings and wrote to newspapers, and corresponded with women in other states about the work still needed. And Nathan read everything she wrote and told her which arguments were strongest, and which were good but could be clearer. and she received his editorial input with the same combination of receptivity and pushback that she brought to everything. And he thought, watching her, that she was one of the most alive people he had ever known, and that he was grateful every day of his life that Clara Hartwell had been honest in her letter. In November of 1885, they had a second child, another boy, whom they named Thomas Henry Donovan after Beatrice's father, who had not fully understood his daughter but who had loved her in his limited way and had died of a heart condition the previous spring. Thomas was quieter than James from the beginning, more observant and more deliberate, and the two boys complemented each other with the chaotic harmony of siblings, who are enough alike to understand each other and enough different to find each other perpetually interesting. In the summer of 1887, when James was 3 and Thomas was not yet 2, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again. She told Nathan on the porch again, same as the first time, with her coffee in the morning directly. He had, by this time, learned to set his cup down before the conversation began on mornings when she had something particular in her eyes. This time the child was a girl. They named her Clara Margaret Donovan. Clara for the woman in Abilene who had written an honest letter about a headstrong and unpredictable woman, and Margaret for the woman Nathan had loved and lost and carried quietly in a chamber of his heart that Beatrice had never asked him to close, because she understood that love was not a finite territory where previous occupants had to be evicted to make room for current ones. Clara came into the world in the spring of 1888 with a disposition that combined, as Hector observed with considerable amusement, her mother's intensity with her father's patience, a combination that in practice meant she was a child who waited for what she wanted with absolute calm and then pursued it with absolute commitment, and who would look at you with Nathan's dark eyes and Beatrice's expression when you attempted to redirect her from a course she had decided on. An expression that said she had heard you, she had considered your input, and she would not be changing direction. By the spring of 1888, the ranch was in the best condition it had ever been in Nathan's tenure. The water rights dispute was long settled. The herd was healthy and well managed, and Beatrice's careful stewardship of the accounts over 6 years had accumulated a reserve that gave them a security Nathan had not had in his early years of running the place alone. They had added a second bedroom for the children, a proper bathroom with a pump, and a larger kitchen, improvements that had been planned and budgeted by Beatrice over 2 years with the methodical patience she brought to all large projects. Hector Calderon's health had begun to decline in the winter of 1887, a slowness in his joints and a fatigue that he bore without complaint, but that Rosa bore with a visible and loving worry, and Nathan and Beatrice had discussed, privately and carefully, what they wanted to provide for Hector and Rosa as Hector became less able to work. What they did was simple and unambiguous. They gave Hector and Rosa the small house on the south edge of the property outright, with a deed and everything in writing, and arranged a modest regular payment from the ranch accounts as a kind of pension, and told them both that this was not charity but obligation, because the Calderon family had helped build this ranch, and what it was belonged to them as much as to the Donovans, and that was the end of it. Hector cried, which he would not have predicted, and which Nathan received with the dignity of a man who understood that some things deserved tears, and the only proper response to a man's tears was to let them happen. Rosa fed them all the goat stew recipe that evening, finally, without being asked, as if the gift of the house had traded for the one thing she had been keeping, and she watched Beatrice eat it and explained each element with a generosity that meant she was giving it entirely, no reservation, no held-back portion, and Beatrice said it was the finest thing she had ever eaten, and meant every word. In the autumn of 1889, Wyoming became the 44th state of the United States, and Beatrice stood in the main street of Laramie with James on one side and Thomas on the other, and little Clara on her hip, and listened to the celebration, and felt something she described to Nathan that evening as complicated and true, which was that Wyoming was a state now, and Wyoming had let women vote for 20 years, and that was remarkable and real and worth celebrating. And also that the country was large and unfinished, and there was still so much work, but that you could stand in the middle of a celebration and hold both of those things at once, the good that had happened and the good that still needed doing, and that this was not pessimism but honesty, and she would always take honesty over the other thing. Nathan stood behind her in the kitchen where she was saying this, and he put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder and said, "I know." And she leaned back into him with the ease of 7 years of marriage and the particular comfort of a person who has found the place that is exactly the right size for them. And they stood there for a moment while the children made noise in the other room, and the night came down over Wyoming, and the mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars. The years that followed moved in the way that good years do, not quickly, not slowly, but with the full weight of time being well used, seasons following seasons in the rhythm of ranch work and school terms, and children growing and conversations that continued for years without resolution, because some conversations are not meant to end, but only to keep deepening. James Donovan grew into a tall, dark-haired boy with his father's hands and his mother's mouth, both the physical feature and its function. He talked readily and thought carefully and had, by the time he was 10, the most thorough understanding of the ranch's operations of anyone his age in Laramie, because his parents had treated him, since he was old enough to understand, as someone whose questions deserved real answers. He could ride as well as Nathan by the time he was 12, and he had begun, with Beatrice's encouragement and Nathan's materials, to keep his own account journal of the cattle's condition through the year, tracking patterns that even Hector, whose health had stabilized though he no longer worked, found worth reading. Thomas grew quieter and more internal, the way some children do who are receiving more than they are transmitting, and he had a gift for drawing that neither of his parents had anticipated, producing detailed and accurate renderings of the ranch and the mountains, and the animals on the property in charcoal and pencil that Beatrice kept in a flat box in her desk, with the seriousness of someone who understood she was looking at something real. She found him a book on draftsmanship from a catalog in Cheyenne, and he consumed it over a single winter. Clara was Clara from very early, a specific and complete person who knew what she wanted and pursued it with the combination of patience and relentlessness that Hector had named when she was less than a year old, and that had only refined itself with age. She was, at 7, already reading above her level, which Beatrice regarded with the combination of pride and complete lack of surprise that a teacher and a reader felt upon seeing these qualities emerge in a child. In the spring of 1891, Nathan received a letter from his cousin in Oregon, a man named Daniel Donovan, who was considerably more adventurous than his name suggested, and who had spent the years since leaving Ohio doing a variety of things in a variety of places, and who now wrote to say that he was coming through Wyoming in June and would like to see Nathan, whom he had not seen in 9 years. The letter was affectionate and also included the information that Daniel was broke, which was characteristic of Daniel, and which Nathan received without surprise or irritation. Daniel arrived in June and stayed for 6 weeks, which was more than Nathan had anticipated, and Beatrice, after a careful assessment period of approximately 48 hours, declared him welcome on the grounds that he was genuine, which was her primary criterion for people, and useful, which he turned out to be, with a talent for repair work that he exercised enthusiastically on the various structures of the ranch that had accumulated the small deficits of time. He was 33 and had never been married and seemed not to have given it serious thought, until he sat across the supper table from the Donovan household for 2 weeks and watched Nathan and Beatrice disagree about a fence-routing decision with the spirited good faith of two people who trusted each other entirely, and found it the most natural thing in the world to say so directly. And he told Nathan privately one evening that he had been doing everything wrong. "I always thought a wife was someone who took the edge off things," Daniel said, "someone calmer than you to balance." "Why would you want the edge taken off?" Nathan said. Daniel looked at him for a long time. "I am going to have to think about that," he said. Daniel left in August and wrote them 3 months later to say he had arrived in San Francisco and met a woman who was very much not calm, and that he thought Nathan might be onto something. Nathan showed the letter to Beatrice, and she read it and laughed, and said she hoped it worked out for Daniel, who seemed like a man who had taken some time to understand himself but was getting there. In the summer of 1892, something arrived at their door that had not been anticipated, and that required everything that both of them had developed over 10 years of marriage, which was the capacity to face a hard thing together. Hector Calderon died on a morning in July, peacefully in his sleep, in the house they had given him, with Rosa beside him. He was 71 years old and had worked this land for 40 of them, and his death was not a tragedy in the sense of being untimely. He had lived fully and with purpose, and with the dignity of a man who had been treated, at least in the last years of his life, as what he was. But it was a grief, real and weighty, and the ranch felt different in the weeks that followed, the way a place feels when someone who has always been part of it is not there anymore. Nathan was the one who told the children, all 3 of them, sitting them down in the kitchen in the way that he and Beatrice had agreed was right, plainly and honestly, without softening the truth into something unrecognizable. James, at 8, understood and was quiet and then cried, which Nathan held him through. Thomas, at 6, asked where Hector went, and Nathan said he thought Hector was somewhere the stew was good, which was not a theologically rigorous answer but which was, given the circumstances, the best he had. Clara, at 4, said she wanted to go see Rosa, and so they all went together and sat with Rosa in her kitchen and drank the tea she made and let her tell them stories about Hector, the young man who had come to Wyoming from Chihuahua with $40 and a blanket and had built something permanent and good here. And the sound of Rosa's voice talking about him was, Nathan thought, its own kind of continuing. They arranged Hector's funeral and attended it, and stood beside Rosa, and Beatrice held Rosa's hand, and Nathan stood very still and felt the particular grief of losing someone who had always simply been there, someone whose presence he had not had to work for or tend to, but had simply relied on the way you rely on the mountains being where they are. Rosa lived on in the house for many years after, and the children were in and out of her kitchen with the ease of people who have always had permission to be somewhere. And Nathan and Beatrice checked on her regularly and without ceremony, and she cooked for the family on Sundays, and the goat stew was on the table every other week, and this was its own kind of continuity. In the years following, the ranch continued to grow. Nathan made shrewd decisions about the herd, helped by Beatrice's accounting and James's increasingly useful observations about the cattle's condition, and the operation expanded carefully and sustainably, not the explosive growth of speculation and risk, but the steady growth of people who understood their land and worked with its capacities rather than against them. They hired 2 additional hands, both of them young men from the area who Nathan trained with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that the ranch's future depended on people who knew how to work it properly, and who Beatrice welcomed with the same direct practicality she brought to everything, assessing them on the basis of their honesty and their willingness to learn rather than what they already knew. James turned 16 in 1900 and was, by general agreement of everyone who worked with him, a rancher. Not a boy learning to be one, but the thing itself, with the instincts and the knowledge and the physical capability and the particular relationship with the land that could not be entirely taught, only grown in someone with the right constitution. He had also, in the preceding year, developed an interest in a girl in Laramie named Alice Whitmore, the daughter of the town's pharmacist, a girl who was quiet where James was talkative and precise where he was expansive, and who had, Beatrice noted to Nathan with a smile, a habit of listening to James's enthusiasms with a calm, patient attention that suggested she was considerably more able than she appeared at first assessment. "She manages him," Nathan observed. "She does not manage him," Beatrice said. "She simply does not get swept along by him. There is a difference." "Ah," Nathan said, "I know that difference." She looked at him. "Do you?" "The woman I married is not a woman who gets swept along by anything," he said. "She is a woman who decides where she is going and arrives there on her own terms. And do you find that acceptable?" She said, in the tone she used when she was asking a real question inside a lightly asked one. He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had 100 evenings in this kitchen, because the kitchen was where the real conversations happened. It was the most honest room in the house. "I find it," he said, "the best thing I know." Thomas, in the years of his quiet and his drawing, had developed into a young man of 17, with a specific and unusual talent that had been, by 1901, the subject of a letter from a school of draftsmanship and technical illustration in Denver, which had received a portfolio that Beatrice had assembled and sent without telling Thomas, which he had discovered when the letter arrived, and which he had, after a moment of completely characteristic stillness, turned to his mother and said only, "You sent them." "Yes," she said. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because you would have told me reasons not to," she said, "and you would have been wrong, and it was easier to simply do it." He looked at her for a moment and then looked at the letter and then said, "That is exactly what I would have done." "I know," she said. He went to Denver in the autumn of 1901, 18 years old and carrying a new portfolio case and the address of a boarding house that Beatrice had confirmed was decent. And Nathan drove him to the Laramie station and shook his hand and then held him, briefly and firmly, and said only that he was proud of him, which was the kind of thing Nathan said rarely enough that, when he said it, it landed with full weight. Thomas wrote from Denver that the school was excellent and the city was extraordinary, and that he was drawing everything. Clara, at 13 in 1901, showed every indication of being the person who would be most difficult to categorize, which Nathan said one evening with the fond exasperation of a man who understood exactly why. And Beatrice said that was fine, that categories were overrated, and that what Clara was becoming was simply herself, which was more than enough. In the winter of 1902, Nathan and Beatrice sat on the porch on a January evening, bundled in heavy coats, with the stars enormous overhead in the clear cold sky, and Nathan had his arm around her, and she had her feet tucked up under her on the bench the way she always did in cold weather, and they were not talking, simply sitting, the way they had learned to be silent together with the comfort of people who have been inside each other's lives for 20 years. "I think about that first letter sometimes," Beatrice said, not loudly, just into the cold air. "Which one?" Nathan said. "The one Clara wrote, the one you read twice." He was quiet for a moment. "I still have it," he said. She turned her head to look at him. "You do?" "In the desk drawer," he said. "With your first letter." She looked at him for a long time. "You kept them." "All of them," he said. "Every one." She turned back to the mountains and the stars, and he felt her settle more firmly against his side the way she did when she was content in a way that did not need to be expressed in words but could be if words were wanted. "She was right about me, you know," Beatrice said. "Clara, what she wrote." "Headstrong and unpredictable," Nathan said. "I am both of those things," Beatrice said. "Yes," he said, "you are. And you knew that before I arrived," she said. "You knew it from the letter." "I knew it," he said, "and I wrote back immediately." She smiled, and he felt it against his shoulder. "That was very smart of you," she said. "It was the smartest thing I ever did," he said. She laughed softly. And then she said, in the way she said things that were true and that she wanted to say precisely, "I think about that woman who stepped off the train, the woman who looked at the mountains and was already deciding." She paused. "I am so glad she decided yes." "So am I," Nathan said. He tightened his arm around her. every single day. The stars over Wyoming were brilliant and close in the January cold, and the creek made its small, faithful sound in the dark. And the ranch was quiet with the particular quiet of a place that is full rather than empty, full of sleeping children and tomorrow's work, and 20 years of a life built carefully and honestly between two people who had found each other at the end of a letter. In the spring of 1903, James Donovan married Alice Whitmore in the same Laramie church where his parents had been married 21 years before, and Beatrice sat beside Nathan in the front pew and held his hand and watched their son stand at the altar with the same stillness Nathan had on his own wedding day, and thought that this was what it looked like when something was going to hold. Alice moved into the ranch house, because James was not going anywhere, and Alice understood this and had not required him to choose. And the house that had once been a silent place for one man became something else entirely, a full and living thing, 4 adults and 2 children, because Thomas came home from Denver for the summer, and Clara was still there at 15 and sharp as a hawk, and Rosa was at the Sunday table every week, and the house was warm with all of it. Nathan, at 49, was a lean and gray at the temples version of the man who had stood on a train platform 21 years before with his hat in his hands, and he moved through the days of his life with the deliberate, unhurried quality of a man who has reached the place he was always heading and knows it. He still rose before dawn. He still rode the fence lines when the work required it. He still made decisions about the ranch with the careful judgment of decades of attention to one piece of land. But there was something in him now that had not been there before Beatrice, not happiness precisely, which was too simple a word, but rightness, the sense of a life that had found its proper shape and was occupying it fully. Beatrice, at 50, was teaching still. She had never stopped, had not wanted to, had continued for 20 years to ride to town 3 days a week and stand in front of rooms full of children and give them the best thing she had to give, which was her serious and complete attention to what they needed to understand. She was in the latter years recognized in Laramie not just as a teacher, but as a particular kind of institution, the woman who had taught half the adults in the county when they were children, and who had the specific authority that comes from years of being consistently right about important things while being honest about the things that were hard. She was still headstrong. She was still, on occasion, unpredictable. Nathan still found both of these things not only acceptable but, on most days, delightful, and on the other days, which were few, he still had the habit of sitting with the disagreement until he understood it properly, because she was almost always right, and the time she was wrong she knew it and said so, and both of those things were qualities he had valued since the first letter. On their 25th wedding anniversary, in November of 1907, the family gathered at the ranch house, all of them, James and Alice with their 3-year-old son William, named for his great-grandfather, and Thomas, who had come back from Denver with work that was beginning to be known beyond Colorado, and with a manner that had grown into itself, and Clara, who was 19 and had recently announced to no one's great surprise that she intended to apply to a school of law in Cheyenne that had begun accepting women, and Rosa, elderly now and moving slowly but present and bright-eyed, and as interested in everything as she had ever been. Nathan stood at the head of the supper table and looked at all of them, and he did not make a speech because he was not a speech-making man, but he picked up his glass and said, simply and directly, that 25 years ago he had received a letter that described a woman as headstrong and unpredictable, and that he had read it twice and written back immediately, and that every day since had proven this to have been the most correct decision of his life. And that if there was anyone at this table who could think of a better reason for celebration he would like to hear it. There was laughter. Young William, not understanding but feeling the warmth of it, laughed along. Beatrice stood beside Nathan and took his hand and said, loud enough for the whole table, that he was still the only man she had ever met who received a description of her worst qualities and found it an advertisement, and that she planned to continue being those things indefinitely, and she hoped everyone present was prepared for it. More laughter. Rosa raised her glass and said something in Spanish that translated, approximately, as here is to people who know what they are worth. And Nathan and Beatrice both understood enough Spanish by now to raise their glasses in return. They ate, all of them, in the warm light of the ranch house that Nathan's father had built on the Wyoming plain in an earlier, harder time. And the mountains were outside the window, where they always were, enormous and patient. And the creek ran in its same channel it had always run. And the land was theirs in the way that land is yours when you have loved it long enough and worked it well enough and shared it honestly enough that it becomes the ground of who you are. After supper, when the children were settled and the table was cleared and the others were gathered in the main room, Nathan and Beatrice went out onto the porch for a few minutes in the November cold, the same porch they had been going out onto together for 25 years, and they stood at the railing and looked west, where the last light was going gold and then orange and then deep red along the edge of the world. 25 years, Beatrice said. Yes, Nathan said. You read that letter twice, she said. I did, and then you wrote back immediately, she said. Before my coffee was finished, he said. She turned and looked at him. This man she had come to on a train across 400 miles of open country, because a letter had been honest, and a response had been immediate. This man who had described Sage After Rain as if it mattered and had meant every word. This man who had held her through arguments and grief, and 3 births and 25 winters, and had never once required her to be less than she was. And she thought that a life was made of the decisions you made when you understood what you were choosing. And that the decision to get on that train had been the one from which everything real had followed. I am very glad, she said, that Clara Hartwell told the truth about me. So am I, Nathan said. He looked at the last light going down over the mountains, his mountains, their mountains, the place that had always been the ground of him and now was the ground of them. So am I, Beatrice. She took his hand. His large, calloused, careful hand that had worked this land for 30 years and had held all 3 of their children in their first minutes and had reached across a kitchen table for hers on 100 ordinary evenings when ordinary was the most extraordinary thing. They stood there together while the light went and the first stars appeared, and the ranch behind them held all the people they loved, and the land stretched out before them into the dark, and it was not a small life. It had never been a small life. It was everything a life was supposed to be, full and honest in particular, built on a letter read twice and a reply written immediately, and a woman who had stepped off a train and looked at the mountains and decided, yes, this is the right direction, and had been right, and had never had any reason to regret it. The stars came out over Wyoming one by one, the way they always did, patient and brilliant, and the creek ran on in the dark. And the porch held them, and the night was cold and clear and entire, and they were home.